If you were sitting at a desk managing global nuclear energy supplies right now, and I gave you a stark, seemingly obvious choice, what would represent a more dangerous threat to your supply chain? A military coup in a West African nation? Or a single washed-out dirt road in the Canadian subarctic?
Oh, I mean, the instinct for almost anyone looking at a Bloomberg terminal is to just say the military coup.
Right, right,
Because regime change, it sounds like a systemic collapse of a nation's export capability.
right.
But a washed-out road, that just sounds like a traffic delay you fix with, a couple of dump trucks and a weekend crew.
Yeah, that feeling is entirely intuitive. You see the word coup, and your brain immediately jumps to indefinite chaos. Geopolitical maneuvering, maybe even sanctions.
Exactly.
But you read road repair and you picture high-vis vests and like a minor budget overrun. But welcome to this custom-tailored deep dive because we are going to explore why that exact intuition is currently blinding global commodity markets.
It really is blinding them.
Yeah. And today's stack of sources is just incredibly revealing. We are pulling from Cameco's latest corporate reports, some highly detailed mining engineering data, and a razor-sharp institutional research piece titled The Uranium Framing Bias.
Which I have to say is a brilliant collection of material to look at together.
It really is.
It moves past the daily headlines and gets to the underlying mechanics of how human psychology and really narrative biases, how they actually price risk in global markets.
Right.
We are looking at this massive, largely unexamined bias in how the world processes supply chain threats.
Right.
And we get to do it through the lens of a breaking real-world crisis, which is the May 2026 supply disruption in Saskatchewan's uranium sector.
Okay, let's unpack this. We need to look at what actually happened in the Canadian subarctic just a few days ago on May 11th, 2026.
Yeah, let's get into the timeline.
So following some incredibly severe spring flooding in northern Saskatchewan, the Smooth Stone River Bridge collapsed. And in most parts of the world, losing a bridge just means, what, redirecting traffic down the interstate?
Yeah, and inconvenient.
Right. But we are talking about the Athabasca Basin. This specific bridge is on Highway 165, which is the primary and really the only viable supply artery connecting the outside world to two critical facilities, Cameco's McArthur River Mine and the Key Lake Processing Mill.
And to grasp the magnitude of this, you really have to understand what McArthur River actually is.
Yeah, please explain that because the numbers are wild.
The engineering data points out that this isn't just a standard mining operation. It is the world's highest-grade uranium mine.
Wow.
The ore they pull out of the ground there often exceeds 20% U₃O₈.
I want to pause on that term, U₃O₈, because it gets thrown around in these reports constantly. For you listening, U₃O₈ is uranium oxide. It's often called yellow cake.
Right.
It's the concentrated material that eventually gets enriched into nuclear fuel. And when we say 20% grade, well, the global average for a uranium mine is a fraction of 1%.
Exactly.
So this rock is roughly 100 times richer than the world average. It's almost incomprehensibly dense with energy.
But having the richest ore on the planet doesn't mean anything if you can't process it. And that is the vulnerability that got exposed on May 11th.
Yeah.
McArthur River cannot operate in isolation. The raw ore it blasts out of the deep earth has to be transported to the Key Lake Mill to be turned into that usable U₃O₈.
The sources outline how deeply integrated these two sites are. If you think about complex supply chains, it's not just about moving the finished product out,
Right, you need stuff to go in.
Exactly. It's like having a world-class restaurant kitchen,
Right.
but the only bridge connecting you to your ingredient suppliers and your dining room just washes away. The Key Lake Mill requires a constant stream of what the industry calls reagents.
And reagents are?
They're these highly specific chemical cocktails. Acids, bases, solvents, stuff needed to dissolve the rock and separate the uranium. No bridge means no trucks. No trucks means no reagent.
And if the mill halts because it can't get those chemical reagents or diesel fuel to run its backup generators, then the McArthur River Mine has nowhere to send its highly radioactive ore.
Right.
They function as a single integrated production unit. So the moment the bridge went down, the entire system essentially froze.
The irony in the timing here is almost painful when you look at the corporate filings.
That was brutal.
Just 6 days prior to the flood, Cameco reported a historic first quarter for 2026. I mean, they had massive profitability, incredible production momentum. They were firing on all cylinders. And then, literally overnight, the supply chain vanished into the Smooth Stone River.
And the global stakes of that vanishing act are staggering. Together, McArthur River and Key Lake produce approximately 18 million pounds of uranium per year.
18 million.
Yeah, that represents roughly 10% of the entire global mine supply. Because of this single infrastructure failure, Key Lake is currently halted and McArthur River activity is drastically reduced.
And what's the monthly impact of that?
Analysts looking at the burn rate of inventory estimate this disruption is pulling about 1.5 million pounds of uranium out of the market for every single month they remain shut down.
Okay, so losing 10% of the global supply of a critical energy resource overnight. That sounds apocalyptic for the nuclear fuel market.
It should be.
My immediate question when reading this was, why isn't the market absolutely panicking? When political unrest happens, trading desks light up, prices gap up, the financial press runs wall-to-wall coverage. But a 10% chunk of global supply goes offline in Canada, and the reaction feels, I don't know, muted.
Muted is the perfect word.
Yeah.
And the institutional research piece we are looking at calls this the uranium framing bias.
Right.
It does this brilliant side-by-side contrast of how the market reacts to the two recent military coups in Niger, one in 2010 and the latest in 2023. And it compares that reaction versus this current Canadian flooding event.
The institutional research makes a really interesting comparison here with those government transitions in Niger. And to be clear to you, the listener, the research isn't taking a political stance on West African governance.
No, not at all.
And neither are we. We are strictly looking at the cold, hard mechanics of how trading desks price these events based on the flow of information. And what the sources reveal is a massive two-part bias, starting with vocabulary.
Yeah, the vocabulary is key. What's fascinating here is that the language used to describe these events completely dictates how generalist investors perceive the risk.
How so?
Well, when the coups happened in Niger, the market commentary immediately defaulted to vivid, terrifying language. Analysts wrote desk notes citing an existential threat to supply, a geopolitical risk premium, regime change.
Those are heavy words. They imply a structural, permanent fracture in the market.
Exactly. Conversely, look at the terminology applied to the Canadian bridge collapse. The financial press and analyst notes use bounded, highly technical language.
Like what?
They talk about force majeure infrastructure repair timelines and a manageable disruption.
Manageable, right.
Yeah. And that vocabulary acts as a subconscious signal to the market. It tells a utility procurement manager that African disruptions are inherently systemic and dangerous, while Western disruptions are merely temporary engineering problems.
Okay, I'm going to push back on that premise for a second.
Not for it.
Because I'm looking at this from the perspective of an institutional investor, and that vocabulary feels somewhat justified. Doesn't a sudden change in a national government actually mean an indefinite timeline of chaos?
You think so, sure.
Right, because you have the potential for expropriation, contracts being ripped up, completely new regulatory regimes. Whereas a Canadian mining company with a massive balance sheet, top-tier insurance, and the rule of law can literally just pay a contractor triple time to rebuild a bridge.
You've just articulated the exact assumption that drives the second bias.
Okay.
Using geography as a proxy for resolution speed.
Geography as a proxy. Got it.
The market implicitly believes that because an event happens in Saskatchewan, it will be fixed predictably. And because an event happens in the Sahel, it is an indefinite, unquantifiable loss. But the data in our sources dismantles this assumption completely.
That was the crazy part.
Yeah, the actual supply numbers tell a wildly different story than the narrative.
Let's get into those numbers, because this was the most surprising part of the research stack for me. Let's look at the reality of the Niger situation first.
So the mathematics of the 2023 coup in Niger are actually very clear. Following the government transition, the primary operator there, U₃O₈, they did face real operational pressure.
Right.
They eventually suspended mining in late 2024 and had permits revoked by early 2025. But even at that absolute maximum point of disruption, Niger's total output is only about 2,000 to 2,500 tons of uranium per year.
Which is how much of the global picture?
In the context of the global market, that translates to just 4 to 5% of global supply.
And that 4 to 5% didn't just vanish the day the government changed hands.
It didn't. The supply loss was incredibly slow-moving. Production continued for a time. It was spread out over 12 to 18 months as on-site inventories were drawn down and operations slowly wound down.
So the market had time to prepare.
Exactly. The market had over a year to digest the reality of the loss and adjust pricing models accordingly.
Now contrast those mechanics with the reality of Cameco in Saskatchewan. This bridge collapse isn't a slow-moving 4% reduction. It is hitting roughly 10% of global supply instantly.
Instantly.
It is a massive single-quarter shock. And the institutional research stresses that there is no short-term substitute for this specific material. You can't just flip a switch at a marginal lower-grade mine in the US or Australia to replace 1.5 million pounds a month of 20% grade ore.
You absolutely cannot. You would need to process millions of tons of extra rock just to get the same amount of yellow cake. And the global milling capacity for that simply does not exist.
Wow.
And to understand why this is causing such quiet terror among utility companies, we have to look at the broader market context right now.
The structural timing of this flood is just brutal. The sources show long-term contract prices for uranium are currently sitting at around $90 a pound, which is the highest we've seen since 2008.
Right.
Spot prices are hovering right around $86 to $87 a pound. The global market is already running a structural deficit, meaning the world's nuclear reactors are consuming more uranium than the world's mines are pulling out of the ground.
To the tune of about 50 million pounds annually.
50 million pounds short every year. That deficit changes the entire dynamic of a supply shock. If a utility company was relying on Cameco for their 2026 deliveries to keep their reactors running, and Cameco issues a force majeure notice saying, sorry, the bridge is gone, we can't deliver, that utility doesn't just shrug.
No, they are forced to go into the spot market to buy replacement fuel.
The analogy that came to mind reading about the spot market dynamic is how utility companies operate a lot like a just-in-time airline.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
If you are flying during a holiday weekend and one major flight gets canceled, the whole system cascades into chaos because there are no standby planes waiting on the tarmac.
Every seat is already booked.
Exactly. In the uranium market, the world's largest producer is Kazatomprom in Kazakhstan. But they are already fully committed, their seats are booked.
And the secondary spot supply, the extra fuel floating around for emergency purchase, is incredibly thin.
So what happens to the price?
Well, when you have forced spot buying from massive utilities in a market that already has a 50 million pound deficit, it is highly, highly consequential for prices. It drives up the cost for every single participant on the grid.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. I'm looking at these numbers, and I'm struggling to understand something about the assumption of Western reliability.
Okay.
The market is pricing this as a temporary, manageable disruption because, quote, it's just water, it's just a road, and Canadian engineering will fix it.
Right, the geography bias.
Exactly. But I was digging into the historical mining data in our stack. Do we have historical proof of what happens when water actually decides to pick a fight with a mining operation in the Athabasca Basin? Because the precedent here is terrifying.
Well, the precedent is extremely sobering. And the research leans heavily on the 2006 Cigar Lake flood to prove this exact point.
What happened there?
Cigar Lake is another massive high-grade mine in the same Saskatchewan region. In 2006, a rockfall triggered an underground water inflow.
When you say water inflow, people might just picture like a leaky basement.
Right.
We really need to explain the geology of the Athabasca Basin.
Yeah, go ahead.
You have this incredibly high-grade ore, but it is sitting right next to, or sometimes directly underneath, a massive layer of high-pressure, water-bearing sandstone.
Right.
It is essentially an underground ocean pushing down on the rock you are trying to blast apart.
And if that rock cracks the wrong way, the mine doesn't just leak, it becomes a high-pressure well. The 2006 Cigar Lake flood inundated the entire underground mine workings.
Just wiped it out.
Completely. And it wasn't fixed in a few weeks by throwing money at a contractor. It took 5 years.
5 years.
Half a decade of complex, highly technical dewatering, drilling new shafts, and stabilizing the ground before they could even think about mining again.
And what did that do to the market?
It structurally tightened the global uranium market and sent spot prices to historic all-time highs.
I kept reading the engineering documents, and it wasn't an isolated incident. There was the 2003 McArthur River cave-in at the exact mine we are talking about today.
Yep.
A roof failure in a tunnel caused an inflow of radioactive water. The engineering report stated it was flowing at 800 cubic meters per hour.
Which is hard to even visualize.
It is an Olympic swimming pool of radioactive slurry filling the tunnels every 3 hours. To survive that kind of hostile geology, modern mining companies have to deploy techniques that sound like science fiction.
The techniques are a true testament to how dangerous the environment is.
Yeah.
Cameco had to deploy raise bore mining. which involves drilling up from below or down from above, specifically so human miners don't have to stand near the unstable rock face.
Ah.
And they had to construct massive underground freeze walls.
I had to read the section on freeze walls twice to make sure I understood it.
It's incredible engineering.
They literally drill a perimeter of pipes deep underground and circulate super chilled brine, essentially industrial coolant, through the rock. They are freezing the groundwater and the sandstone solid, forming an impermeable 100-foot thick barrier of ice just so they can safely extract the uranium behind it.
Right.
They are fighting the earth with giant underground refrigerators.
It is a marvel of geotechnical engineering. But it highlights the crucial lesson the market is completely ignoring right now.
Which is?
The Athabasca Basin is a deeply, profoundly challenging environment. The manageable framing for Western operational risk was proven empirically wrong in 2006 with Cigar Lake.
Yeah, 5 years of delays isn't manageable.
Exactly. Those events removed hundreds of millions of pounds of supply from the market. Relying on a single, non-redundant subarctic dirt road in 2026 to supply 10% of the world's nuclear fuel, it strongly suggests we haven't learned that lesson. Water, in this specific geography, is a formidable adversary.
So what does this all mean? When we strip away the terrifying vocabulary used for African political events, and we strip away the comforting technical vocabulary used for Canadian infrastructure failures, what is the honest conclusion these analysts are presenting to utility procurement desks?
The honest conclusion is that the Cameco flooding event is, by a meaningful margin, the more dangerous near-term threat to global nuclear supply.
Without question.
When you put the data side by side, the Canadian event is larger in volume, 10% versus Niger's 4%.
Right.
It is faster acting. It happened overnight as opposed to a slow 18-month wind down. It has zero substitutes at that specific ore grade. And crucially, because it involves water damage to remote transport infrastructure, where the weather window for repair is rapidly closing, it is a genuinely unknown duration.
The fact that it receives softer language in the financial press is just a framing artifact. It is a psychological bias, not an analytical conclusion based on the math.
Exactly. Any analyst or trading desk that treats a Western operational disruption as a lower risk category than an African sovereign disruption, by default, without actually checking the underlying supply numbers, is carrying an unexamined bias.
And markets hate unexamined bias.
As the research bluntly points out, markets periodically punish that exact type of complacency.
Which brings us back to where we started. The ultimate takeaway for you listening right now is to recognize how deeply narrative biases infect our processing of risk. Treating familiar geography as inherently safer sounds like common sense, but it actively blinds us to what the actual supply data, the geological reality, and the sheer volume numbers are screaming at us.
Numbers over narratives, always.
Always. Whether you are analyzing global commodity markets, looking at semiconductor tech supply chains, or just trying to manage logistics for your own business, unexamined assumptions about what constitutes a safe jurisdiction will eventually collide with reality. Risk is ultimately about the numbers, the bottlenecks, and the single points of failure.
It's about recognizing how thin the thread holding complex systems together really is, regardless of the flag flying over the facility.
Which leaves me with one final lingering question for you to ponder on your own. We spend so much time worrying about the geopolitical chessboard. But as climate-related hydrological events like these massive, unprecedented spring floods intensify across northern Canada, and as historical freeze-thaw cycles continue to shift unpredictably, altering the very ground these supply chains are built on, is the real existential threat to the future of clean, reliable nuclear energy not global geopolitics at all? Is the real threat simply the exorbitant, unpalatable cost of trying to build and maintain a backup dirt road in the subarctic? Until next time, keep digging into the data.